He promised his late friend that he would never get close to his daughter in any way. But she returned years later, a virgin, mysterious, carrying in her eyes the silence of someone who lost more than they ever had. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Stay tuned.
The March rain beat against the windows of Blackwood Manor with an almost cruel insistence, as if trying to wash away the sins accumulated in the dark stone walls. Edward stood motionless before the office window, watching the droplets run down, the glass in irregular trajectories, each following its own path to destruction. At 42, he had learned that some things in life followed exactly the same pattern as raindrops, inevitable, unpredictable, and always ending on the ground. Banas's phone rang for the 5th time in less than an hour. He knew who it was without looking at the display. Alexander Parker's lawyers didn't rest, even after their client's death, a death that still echoed in his mind like a discordant chord, full of unanswered questions and promises that now weighed like stones on his shoulders. Alexander had died of a heart attack, the doctors said, but Edward had known the man for more than 20 years, knew every secret hidden in his drawers, every lie constructed with an architect's precision. Alexander didn't die of a weak heart. Alexander died of guilt. And now she was coming home. Isabella Parker. The name danced in his mind like a forbidden melody. The daughter Alexander had hidden from the world for 19 years, raised far from the United States, far from the dirty business, far from the truth. Edward knew her only through scattered photographs and cautious accounts from her father, but he knew she carried something on her face that shouldn't exist, the unmistakable resemblance to Elizabeth. Elizabeth. The name still burned his throat when he dared to pronounce it, even if only in thought. The woman he had loved in silence, the woman Alexander had taken for himself, the woman who had disappeared like smoke, leaving only traces of perfume and unanswered questions. And now her daughter was returning, bringing with her not only the inheritance of an empire built on questionable choices, but also the weight of a past that Edward thought was buried. The sound of tires on gravel pulled him from his thoughts. She had arrived. Edward adjusted his dark tie, ran his hands through his greying temples, and walked to the entrance hall. The manor seemed to awaken with her presence, shadows dancing in the corridors like spectators of a long-awaited show. The portraits on the walls, mostly of ancestors dead for decades, seemed to observe him with a morbid curiosity. Even the air seemed denser, charged with anticipation and fear. The door opened before he reached the hall. Thomas, the butler who had served the family for more than 30 years, held the doorknob with the solemnity of someone announcing the arrival of a ghost. And perhaps that was exactly what was happening. Isabella entered like an apparition. Small, but with a presence that occupied all available space. She carried 2 leather suitcases and a look that transitioned between curiosity and discomfort. The dark hair fell in waves over her shoulders, framing a face that was, simultaneously, that of a frightened child and a determined woman. But it was her eyes that hit him like a punch in the stomach, green like Elizabeth's, with the same disturbing intensity, the same ability to seem to see through the masks that people wore. "Edward Blackwood," she said, and her voice carried a subtle accent, the result of years in Europe, but there was something more there, a musicality that was familiar to him. "You look older than I imagined." He almost smiled. The brutal frankness was typical of youth, but there was something in the way she observed him that suggested a premature maturity, as if she had learned too early to read people through their imperfections. "And you look exactly as I expected," he responded, extending his hand. When she touched it, an electric shock ran up his arm. Her skin was soft and cool, but there was a firmness in the grip that spoke of inner strength. "I'm sorry for your father's loss." Isabella studied him for a moment that seemed eternal. "Do you really feel sorry? Or is that just what people say in situations like this?" The question caught him off guard. Alexander had always mentioned that his daughter was direct, but he hadn't expected her to be able to disarm him so easily. "Yes, I do." Alexander was complex, but he was my partner and friend for many years. "Friend," she repeated, as if testing the flavor of the word. What kind of friend hides the existence of a daughter for so long? Thomas discreetly cleared his throat, breaking the tension of the moment. Miss Isabella, would you like me to take your luggage to your room? Please, she replied, without taking her eyes off Edward. I suppose you've already chosen where? I'll stay. The East Tower room, he said, ignoring the provocation. It was the room your father always said would be yours when you returned. She nodded slowly, as if processing not just the words, but also everything that hadn't been said. And where did my mother stay when she visited? The question fell like a blade. Edward felt the air escape from his lungs, but kept his expression neutral. Your mother. My biological mother. Elizabeth, if I'm not mistaken. My father mentioned the name a few times, always in passing, always with a strange tone in his voice. Isabella tilted her head, studying him. Did you know her? I knew her, he admitted, because lying would be useless. Sooner or later she would discover the truth. But that was a long time ago. How long? 20 years. And she died when I was born. Edward hesitated. The truth was more complicated, more painful, and definitely more dangerous. She disappeared. Isabella frowned. Disappeared how? People don't just disappear. Some people do, he said, turning to walk toward the office, especially when they have reasons to. She followed. Him, her footsteps echoing on the marble corridor. The mansion seemed to swallow them as they walked, the portraits on the walls observing their progression like silent witnesses to a drama that had been unfolding for decades. What reasons would my mother have to disappear and abandon me? Edward stopped before the office door, his hand on the doorknob. Some questions, Isabella, are too dangerous to be answered, at least for now. The East Tower room was a contradiction in stone and velvet. Isabella stood motionless in the center of the environment, absorbing every detail with the intensity of someone trying to decipher a code. The walls, covered in Victorian wallpaper in dark green tones, contrasted with mahogany furniture that seemed to have been chosen for a princess, but a princess in exile. The canopy bed dominated the space, its golden silk curtains tied with cords that shone like old gold under the filtered light from the window. But it was the piano that caught her attention. A small grand piano, positioned near the window that faced the inner gardens, its keys yellowed by time and use. She approached as if drawn by an invisible magnet, her fingers trembling when they touched the closed lid. There was something familiar there, something that made her chest tighten with an inexplicable longing. Your mother played, said Edward's voice behind her. Isabella turned, startled. She hadn't heard him enter. He remained at the threshold, hands in his pockets, observing her with an expression she couldn't decipher. There was sadness there, but also something darker, more dangerous. You said she disappeared when I was born. I didn't say that. I said she disappeared. Edward entered the room, closing the door behind him. The sound echoed like a final decree. Elizabeth disappeared when you were 2 years old. The name fell between them like a stone in still waters, creating waves that expanded in silence. Isabella felt something move inside her chest. A memory. That wasn't memory. A recognition that made no sense. Elizabeth, she repeated, testing the sound in her own voice. Why did no one ever tell me her real name? Because your father wanted to protect you from the truth. What truth? Edward walked to the window, looking at the gardens where the first shadows of the afternoon were beginning to form. Elizabeth wasn't married to your father when you were born. In fact, she was... He hesitated, as if the words burned his throat. She was my fiancée. The silence that followed was so dense that Isabella could hear it buzzing in her ears. She leaned on the piano, her legs suddenly weak. Your fiancé? We were going to get married in December 1984, but your father... Edward closed his eyes as if the memory was physically painful. Alexander always wanted everything that was mine, and Elizabeth was the most precious thing I had ever found. So, he stole her from you? He won her over. The correction came loaded with bitterness. Alexander knew how to be charming when he wanted to. He knew how to promise things I couldn't offer. Money, status, a life without the complications my family carried. Isabella opened the piano lid, revealing the yellowed keys. Without thinking, she pressed one of them. The sound echoed through the room, a solitary and melancholic note that seemed to carry all the weight of the story being revealed. And you simply accepted. I was 22, Isabella. I was too proud to fight for someone who had chosen another man. Edward turned to face her. Besides, Alexander was my business partner. Fighting for Elizabeth would mean destroying everything we had built together. So you chose the business. I chose what I thought was right at the time. Isabella touched another key, then another. Without realizing, her fingers began to form a simple, nostalgic melody. She didn't know where this music came from, but she felt as if she had known it forever. She used to play that song, said Edward, his voice almost a whisper. Isabella stopped playing abruptly, as if the keys had become embers. How do you know what song this is? I don't even know how to play it. Because I used to listen when she rehearsed. She composed this melody for our wedding. Edward approached the piano, his fingers lightly touching the polished wood. She called it Lost Promise. Isabella's heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. And after she left with my father? After that she disappeared, literally. Edward moved away from the piano, as if the proximity was dangerous. One morning she was simply no longer there. She left you sleeping in the crib, and a letter for Alexander saying she could no longer bear the life she was living. And you never heard from her again? Alexander hired detectives, investigators, spent a fortune searching, but Elizabeth had disappeared as if she had never existed. Isabella sat on the piano bench, her legs finally giving way. The story was like a puzzle whose pieces fit together in a painful way, revealing an image she wasn't prepared to see. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know, and because... Edward hesitated, running his hands through his hair. Because you look very much like her, not just physically. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking, how your eyes shine when you're challenging someone, even the way you just played the piano. It's as if she had returned. Isabella stared at him, looking for lies in his expression. But all she saw was a deep pain, a regret that had crystallized in lines around his eyes and in the stiffness of his shoulders. You still love her, she said, and it wasn't a question. I loved the woman she was, the woman I knew. Edward walked to the door, stopping with his hand on the doorknob. But that was a long time ago, Isabella, and you are not her. No, she agreed, rising from the bench. I'm not, but I am her daughter. And if there's one thing I learned in the years I spent away, it's that people always pay for their mistakes, always. Edward observed her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching for something in her face that perhaps he could never find. Be careful, Isabella. The thirst for revenge can consume a person faster than anything else. Who said I want revenge? She smiled, but there was something sharp in that smile. Maybe I just want to understand why my mother thought disappearing was better than fighting. When Edward left, closing the door behind him, Isabella returned to the piano. This time she played the complete melody, letting the notes flow through. Her fingers like inherited memories, and as she played she could swear she smelled jasmine in the air, as if her mother was there, whispering secrets only she could hear. The following days at Blackwood Manor unfolded like a strange ritual of courtesy and tension. Isabella woke up early, had breakfast alone in the dining room while watching Edward through the office windows, always on the phone, always with that grave expression that seemed carved in stone. He avoided prolonged encounters, appearing only at meals with polite conversations about the weather, business, or practical questions about her adaptation. But she felt the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't watching, an intensity that made her skin tingle. On the fifth morning, while exploring the library, Isabella found something that made her heart race. Among ancient volumes of poetry and economics treatises, there was an entire section dedicated to sheet music. Not common sheet music, but handwritten compositions, some with notes in the margins in a delicate handwriting that she instinctively recognized as her mother's. "Sonata for an Impossible Love," read one of them, "Variations on Solitude." "Elegy for What Never Was." Each title was like a gentle stab in her chest, revealing a woman who had translated her pain into music. "She used to spend hours here," said a voice behind her. Isabella turned, expecting to find Edward, but came face to face with Thomas the butler. The elderly man held a tray with coffee and cookies, but there was something in his eyes that suggested his presence. There was no coincidence. "Did you know her well?" Thomas placed the tray on a nearby table and sighed. Miss Elizabeth was special. She had a light that illuminated any room she entered, but she also had a deep sadness, as if she carried a weight she couldn't share with anyone. "Why did she leave with my father?" The butler hesitated, his elderly hands trembling slightly. "It's not my place to speak of these things, miss." "Thomas," said Isabella, approaching him, "I need to understand. I need to know who my mother really was." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the risks of his next words. "Miss Elizabeth didn't leave out of love, miss. She left out of fear." "Fear of what?" "Of Mr. Alexander. Of what he was capable of doing when he didn't get what he wanted." Thomas lowered his voice. "There were things he did, ways he had of convincing people. Your mother discovered this too late." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of things?" "The kind of things that make a pregnant woman flee in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything she loved." Thomas headed for the door, stopping before leaving. "If you want to truly know your mother, miss, look in the attic. There's a cedar chest hidden behind the old paintings. She left things there, hoping that one day you would find them." When he left, Isabella remained standing among the sheet music, her heart beating like a war drum. Thomas's words echoed in her mind, creating images she preferred not to visualize. Alexander, the father she had known through affectionate letters and sporadic visits, was beginning to reveal himself as someone completely different. That afternoon, she waited until she was sure Edward had left for meetings in the city before going up to the attic. The space was dusty and full of shadows, illuminated only by the weak light that filtered through small windows covered with cobwebs. Furniture covered by sheets created ghostly shapes, and the air carried the smell of time and kept secrets. She found the chest exactly where Thomas said it would be. Made of aged cedar, it was locked, but the key hung from a cord tied to the handle. With trembling hands, Isabella turned it in the lock. What she found inside changed everything. Letters, dozens of them, tied with blue silk ribbons. Photographs of a young and radiant woman, sometimes alone, sometimes beside a visibly younger and in love Edward. But it was the diaries that made her sit on the dusty floor, forgetting everything around her. Her mother's delicate handwriting told a story of love and terror that made her stomach churn. Elizabeth had written about her engagement to Edward, about the simple and pure happiness she felt by his side, but also about how Alexander had begun to appear in her life, first as a friend, then as an insistent suitor. September 15th, 1984. Alexander showed up today at the sheet music store where I work. He said he wants to commission a special composition for the company anniversary. He offered an absurd amount. Edward says we shouldn't accept that there's something strange in his partner's behavior lately, but the money would help us so much. October 3rd, 1984. Alexander insists on private meetings to discuss the composition. His hands stay too long on mine when he shows me the documents. Edward is working too much. I hardly see him. Sometimes I wonder if he really loves me, or if I'm just another responsibility in his life. October 20th, 1984. I discovered why Edward has been so distant. Alexander told him lies about me, said he saw me with another man. When I tried to explain, he wouldn't listen. He said he needs time to think. Alexander offered to console me. His kindness seems genuine, but there's something in his eyes that frightens me. Isabella turned the pages with growing horror, following the deterioration of her mother's relationship with Edward and Alexander's increasing manipulation. The last entry made her cry. January 2nd, 1985. I'm pregnant with Edward's child, but he thinks the baby is Alexander's. The lies have become our reality. Alexander promised to take care of us, but demands that I marry him in exchange. He said that if I refuse, he'll tell everyone I'm a prostitute, that the baby could be anyone's. He has fake photographs, forged, documents. Edward would never believe me now. I have no choice. God forgive me, I have no choice. When Isabella finally stopped reading, her tears had stained the old pages. The truth was crueler than she had imagined. Her mother had been the victim of elaborate manipulation, forced to choose between her own reputation and the protection of her yet unborn daughter. Found what you were looking for? Edward's voice made her start. He was at the entrance to the attic, observing her with an undecipherable expression. Isabella didn't know how long he had been there, but the way he looked at the diaries in her hands suggested he knew their content. "You knew," she said, her voice choked. "You knew everything and never told me." "I discovered the truth too late," he answered, approaching slowly. "When I finally understood what Alexander had done, Elizabeth had already disappeared, and you were a child who needed stability, not more trauma. She was innocent. You abandoned her when she needed you most. I was young and proud. I believed the lies because it was easier than fighting for the truth." Edward knelt beside her, his eyes fixed on the diaries. "I've spent the last 20 years paying for that mistake." Isabella stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The pain in his face wasn't just longing, it was guilt crystallized in wrinkles and grey hair. "She loved you. Until the end, she loved you." "I know," he whispered. "And that makes everything even worse." The weeks following the discovery of the diaries transformed the dynamics of Blackwood Manor irreversibly. Isabella could no longer look at Edward without seeing the young man in the photographs, the one who smiled with genuine happiness beside her mother. And Edward, in turn, seemed unable to be in the same room with her, without his eyes unconsciously seeking similarities with Elizabeth in every gesture, in every expression. It was during this period of silent tension that Eric Walters appeared. Isabella was in the garden, sitting on the stone bench where her mother used to compose, when she heard the sound of a car approaching. It was a black BMW, elegant but not ostentatious, that stopped in front of the main entrance. The man who got out was approximately 30 years old, brown hair combed with precision, and a smile that managed to be charming and calculated at the same time. "Isabella Parker, I presume," he said, approaching with confident steps. "I'm Eric Walters, the lawyer responsible for your father's estate. I tried to schedule a meeting with Edward, but he seems to be avoiding my calls." There was something in the way he pronounced Edward's name that made Isabella frown, a tone that suggested familiarity and perhaps resentment. "Did you know my father well?" "Very well," answered Eric, sitting beside her on the bench without waiting for an invitation. "In fact, we were close, closer than many people know." Before Isabella could ask what that meant, Edward appeared on the veranda, his expression changing dramatically when he saw who was in the garden. He descended the steps hurriedly, but trying to maintain a composure that didn't completely disguise his unease. "Eric," he said, stopping a few meters away, "I wasn't expecting you here." "I imagine not," responded the young lawyer, rising with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "especially considering that you have been systematically ignoring my attempts to contact you." "We've been communicating through my lawyers, as is appropriate." "Appropriate," Eric laughed, but the sound had no joy. "Interesting choice of words coming from you." Isabella observed the exchange of barbs with growing curiosity. There was a story there, something that went beyond professional legal issues. The hostility between the two men was almost palpable. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in the office," suggested Edward, casting a meaningful look at Isabella. "Oh, no," said Eric, sitting down again. "I think Isabella should hear what I have to say. After all, it directly concerns her." Edward approached, his hands closed into fists. "Eric, I warned—" "You warned what?" "That I should keep quiet about the truth. That I should accept being treated like a dirty secret for the rest of my life. Eric turned to Isabella, his eyes shining with a dangerous intensity. "Do you know who I really am, Isabella?" She shook her head, feeling she was about to hear something that would change. "Everything again. I am your half-brother, Alexander Parker's illegitimate son, the result of an affair he had while officially married." Eric smiled bitterly. "I was raised far away, supported from a distance, recognized just enough not to be a public scandal. But I always promised that one day I would claim my place in the family." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. A brother. She had a brother and had never known. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because Edward has been hiding something very important from you, something that will completely change your financial situation." Eric took a leather folder from his briefcase. "There's a second will, Isabella, one that Edward never mentioned." Edward stepped forward. "Eric, stop this." "Why? Afraid she'll discover the truth?" Eric opened the folder, revealing official documents. "Your father left very specific instructions. If you marry me, thus acknowledging our family connection and officially uniting the Parker heirs, you'll receive not just your portion of the inheritance, but the totality of the assets that belonged to Alexander." Isabella took the documents with trembling hands. The legal language was complex, but the essence was clear. By marrying Eric, she would become one of the wealthiest women in America. "And if I don't marry you? Then you inherit only a small part, while the rest goes into a fund controlled." "Everything well by Edward." She looked at Edward, who had visibly paled. "Is this true?" "It's true that the will exists," he admitted, "but not for the reasons Eric is suggesting." "Then why did you hide it from me?" Edward ran his hands through his hair, seeming to have aged 10 years in a few minutes. "Because I knew Alexander better than anyone. He didn't do anything without ulterior motives. This will is a trap." "A trap," Eric laughed, "or you simply don't want to give up control over the Parker fortune?" "You don't know your own history, Eric," said Edward, turning to face him. "You don't know why Alexander really kept you hidden all these years." "Enlighten me." "Because you're not just his illegitimate son, you're Elizabeth's son." The words fell like bombs in the silent garden. Isabella felt the air escape from her lungs while Eric quickly paled. "Impossible," he muttered. "My mother was Clara Walters, a secretary who—" "It was the false name Elizabeth used when she fled," said Edward, his voice loaded with an old sadness. "Alexander found her 2 years after she disappeared. She was pregnant again, desperate and without resources. He offered protection in exchange for silence. You were born 6 months later." Isabella looked at Eric with new eyes, looking for similarities that now made sense. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, even the way he tilted his head when thoughtful. They really were siblings. Blood siblings. "So, the will," she began. "It's Alexander's last manipulation," completed Edward. "He knew you would meet, one day. He knew Eric would come after his inheritance, and he found a way to force a situation that would amuse him even from the grave." Eric rose abruptly, his face red with anger. "You're lying. My mother never told me." "Your mother died when you were 15, without ever revealing the truth because Alexander threatened her until the end," said Edward relentlessly. "He supported her, paid for your education, but always made it clear that if she told who you really were, she would lose everything." Isabella walked to the fountain in the center of the garden. The running water seemed to be the only normal sound. In a world that had become completely surreal, she had a brother who wanted to marry her for money without knowing they were real family. "Even if this is true," said Eric, trying to regain his composure, "the will is still valid, and you can still choose, Isabella." She turned to face them. These 2 men who represented different aspects of her past and her future. "Choose between marrying my own brother for money, or letting you 2 continue to decide my life for me." "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," she interrupted. "You 2 have spent this entire afternoon talking about me as if I were a piece in a chess game. Neither of you asked me what I want." Edward took a step toward her. "Isabella." "No," she said, raising her hand. "I need time. I need to process all this away from you 2 and your manipulations." She began walking toward the mansion, stopping only to look over her shoulder. "And when I decide what to do with my life, you can be sure the decision will be mine alone." Night fell on Blackwood Manor like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a fine rain that beat against the windows in a hypnotic rhythm. Isabella remained in her room, surrounded by her mother's diaries and the day's revelations, trying to make sense of a reality that seemed to reconfigure with each moment. Eric was her brother. Edward had hidden crucial information about her, inheritance, and somewhere in the middle of this confusion of lies and partial truths, she needed to find her own path. 3 soft knocks on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, expecting to find Thomas with the evening tea. Instead, Edward appeared at the threshold, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought you might need this," he said, raising the bottle. "It's been a difficult day." Isabella watched him as he approached. There was something different in his posture, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. The masks seemed to have fallen, leaving only a tired man who carried the weight of many regrets. "Why didn't you tell me about the will from the beginning?" Edward poured the wine, his hands trembling slightly. "Because I knew Alexander. Every document he signed, every clause he included, had a hidden purpose. This will wasn't made to benefit you, Isabella. It was made to create exactly the situation we experience today. Don't you think I should have had the chance to decide for myself?" "You should have," he admitted, handing her a glass. "But I was trying to protect you from the manipulation he planned even after death." Isabella took a sip of the wine, feeling the warm liquid run down her throat. "And Eric? Do you really believe he's my brother?" "I'm certain of it. The dates coincide. The physical resemblance is undeniable and—" Edward hesitated, as if deciding how much of the truth to reveal. "I found Elizabeth a few months before she died." The wine almost fell from Isabella's hand. "What?" "It was in 2003. She was admitted to a private hospital in San Francisco under a false name. Alexander sent me to handle some business in the city, and by chance I saw her leaving the building." Edward sat in the chair near the window, looking at the rain. "She was thinner, with grey hair, but they were the same green eyes, the same ones you have. Did you speak to her?" "I tried, but when she saw me, she panicked. She screamed for me to stay away, said Alexander would find out, and that he would kill you both if—" "He knew we had met." Edward took a long sip of wine. "She mentioned a son, said he couldn't know who she really was." "Eric." "Eric." Alexander had achieved what he wanted, keeping her under control through the children. She died 3 weeks later, of cancer, alone, frightened, and using a name that wasn't hers. Tears rolled down Isabella's cheeks. Her mother had spent her last years as a fugitive, terrified by the possibility that her choices would harm the children she barely knew. "Why did you never tell me this?" "Because I wanted you to remember her as the woman from the diaries, as the brave and passionate person she was, not as the frightened victim she became." Isabella stood up, walking to the window where Edward was sitting. The rain had intensified, creating streams that ran down the glass like tears. "You still blame yourself for her death?" "I blame myself for not having fought when I should have, for choosing pride over love, for having let Alexander destroy the only pure and good thing that ever existed in my life. Would she not have died if you had stayed together?" "I don't know, maybe yes, maybe no, but she would have died knowing she was loved, and not as a terrified fugitive." Isabella placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You can't live the rest of your life paying for mistakes you made when you were young." Edward looked at her, and for the first time since they met, she saw tears in his eyes. "I can't stop, Isabella, especially when I look at you and see everything. I lost." Something changed in the air between them. The rain, the wine, the intimacy of the shared confessions created an atmosphere charged with dangerous possibilities. Isabella felt her heart race when she realized how close they were, how his hand had moved to cover hers. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "you shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be so close to me." "Why?" "Because I'm not a good man. Because I carry too much weight, too much guilt. And because—" he hesitated. fighting against words that wanted to escape. Because when I look at you, I don't just see the daughter of the woman I loved. I see you, and that frightens me more than anything. Isabella's heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. There was something hypnotic in his vulnerability, in the way he admitted his demons without trying to hide behind masks. Maybe you should stop punishing yourself for the past and start living in the present, she said, moving closer. The present is dangerous, he replied, but didn't move away. The present is you here, looking at me as if I were worthy of something beyond guilt and regret. Maybe you are. Before either of them could think about the consequences, Isabella's lips touched his. It was a gentle kiss at first, hesitant, but that quickly transformed into something more urgent when Edward responded, pulling her closer. It was wrong on so many levels that neither wanted to stop to analyze them. She was the daughter of the woman he had loved. He was the guardian, chosen by her father. The age difference, the legal complications, the scandal this would cause, everything disappeared under the weight of a desire that had been silently growing since the first day. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Edward rested, his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as if in pain. "This can't happen," he said, but his hands still held her face. "Why not?" "Because you deserve someone who doesn't carry so much dead weight. Because you have your whole life ahead of you, and I'm a man who lives in the past. Because—" he opened his eyes, looking directly into hers. "Because if I allow this to continue, I won't be able to protect you from myself anymore." Isabella smiled, a sad but determined smile. "And what if I don't want to be protected?" Before he could answer, the sound of footsteps in the corridor made them quickly move apart. The door opened without warning, revealing Eric, who stopped abruptly, seeing the scene. The wine glasses, their proximity, the intimate atmosphere. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested the interruption wasn't accidental. "We need to talk, Isabella, about the will and about some things I discovered about our dear guardian here." Edward stood up, his posture instantly changing to defensive. "What do you want, Eric?" "Justice," answered the young lawyer, entering the room without invitation, "and the complete truth. Because there are things about you, Edward, that Isabella still doesn't know. Things that explain why our father really wrote that will." Isabella looked between the two men, feeling she was about to discover another secret that would change everything again. "What things?" Eric closed the door behind him with a deliberate movement, his eyes alternating between Isabella and Edward with a calculated intensity. There was something different in his posture, a predatory confidence that wasn't present during the afternoon. In his right hand he carried a yellowed envelope and a small digital recorder. "First of all," he said, approaching the table where the wine glasses were, "I want you to know that I take no pleasure in what I'm about to reveal. But the truth, however painful it may be, always finds a way to come to light." Edward stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Eric and Isabella. "If you have something to say, say it now, but stop this theater." "Theater?" Eric laughed, but the sound was loaded with bitterness. "You want to talk about theater, Edward? How about we discuss your performance as a remorseful man, as the selfless protector of the daughter of the woman you claim to have loved? What are you getting at?" Eric placed the recorder on the table, his finger hovering over the play button. "I want to get to March 15, 1987. Do you remember that date?" Isabella saw the color drain from Edward's face. Whatever date Eric had mentioned, it had a devastating significance for him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do. It's the day you signed the papers authorizing Elizabeth's compulsory internment at St. Helen's Clinic." Eric pressed the button, and Alexander Parker's voice, recorded years ago, echoed through the room. "Edward, are you sure this is what you want? Once we sign these documents, there's no going back." "She's sick, Alexander. The hallucinations, the delusions about me and you gets better this way, for her and for all of us. And the child? The child will be better away from this instability. You can take care of her, raise Isabella away from all this. And if Elizabeth gets better, if she wants her daughter back, then we'll talk. But for now, it's the best solution." The silence that followed the recording was deafening. Isabella felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Edward, the man she had just kissed, the man who claimed to have loved her mother, had authorized her to be committed against her will. This can't be true, she murmured, looking at Edward for an explanation, for anything that could deny what she had just heard. Edward closed his eyes, as if gathering strength to face a moment he knew would come one day. Isabella, let me explain. Explain. What? Her voice rose an octave. That you committed my mother to a mental institution, that you separated her from me when I was 2 years old. She was sick, said Edward, his voice loaded with an old pain. After you were born, Elizabeth developed severe depression. She couldn't take care of you, couldn't take care of herself. There were days when she didn't recognize anyone. Lies, spat Eric. She was desperate, trying to escape a forced marriage with a man who had blackmailed her. And you, instead of helping her, preferred to get rid of the problem. It wasn't like that. Then how was it? Isabella approached him, tears rolling down her face. How was it, Edward? Because the recording is quite clear. Edward turned to the window, watching the rain that continued to fall. When he spoke, his voice was full of an exhaustion that seemed accumulated over decades. Elizabeth came to me 3 months after you were born. She appeared at my door in the middle of the night, with you in her arms, begging for me to take you both away. She said she couldn't stand living with Alexander anymore, that he forced her to... Things a woman shouldn't be forced to do. Isabella flinched at imagining what that meant. I wanted to help. God knows I wanted to. But Alexander had influence, money, connections. He threatened to destroy not just my company, but any chance I had of having a normal life. And when he discovered that Elizabeth had come to me, Edward paused, running his hands through his hair. He had her declared mentally unstable. He got 2 psychiatrists who testified that she was dangerous to herself and to the child. And you believed it? I didn't know what to believe. Alexander showed me medical reports, psychiatric evaluations, evidence that Elizabeth had tried to hurt herself. He said that if I didn't sign the internment papers, he would make her lose custody of you anyway, but in a way that would leave her on the street without resources. Eric shook his head. How convenient. And you never questioned these evaluations? I questioned them later. Too late. Edward turned to face Isabella. I discovered that the doctors were paid by Alexander, that the reports were false. But when I tried to reverse the situation, Elizabeth had already disappeared from the clinic. What do you mean, disappeared? One morning, she was simply no longer there. The staff said she had left during the night, but didn't know how. The security cameras for that night were malfunctioning. Edward laughed bitterly. Alexander was always very efficient at solving his problems. Isabella sat heavily on the bed, trying to process the revelations. So you're saying my father forged evidence to commit my mother, and then made her disappear? I'm saying that Alexander was capable of anything to get what he wanted, and what he wanted was to have you for himself, to raise you as his daughter, away from any influence from Elizabeth or me. And you allowed it, she said, her voice loaded with disappointment. Even suspecting the truth, you allowed it. I allowed it because I was a coward, admitted Edward, because it was easier to believe the lies than to fight against a system Alexander controlled, and because, he hesitated, looking directly in her eyes, because part of me believed you would be better off away from all this madness. Eric approached Isabella, placing his hand on her shoulder in an apparently protective gesture. Now you understand why our father wrote that will. He knew that one day the truth would come out and wanted to ensure you had a real choice. A chance to choose someone who didn't have their hands dirty with our mother's blood. Elizabeth didn't die because of me, said Edward, his voice low but firm. She died because Alexander systematically destroyed her year after year, and you know that as well as I do, Eric. Do I? Eric smiled, but it was a cold smile. Or, maybe I know that you had your own reasons for wanting Elizabeth out of the way. What reasons? Business, Edward. Always business. Eric took a folder from the envelope he had brought. Do you remember the merger with the German company in 1987? The one that made you millionaires overnight? Edward paled again. The German company had very strict moral clauses. They didn't do business with people involved in family scandals. And a psychiatric internment, an unstable woman claiming rights over a child, that would be exactly the kind of scandal that would make the deal fall apart. Isabella looked at Edward, searching for a denial in his eyes. But all she saw was guilt and recognition. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Edward closed his eyes, defeated. "It's true that the deal with the Germans was important. It's true that a family scandal could have harmed it. But I swear, Isabella, I swear I thought I was doing what was best for everyone." "For everyone," she repeated, rising from the bed. "Or for your bank account." When Edward opened his eyes to respond, she was already walking toward the door. "Isabella, wait." "No," she said, stopping only to look back. "I'm tired of waiting, tired of half-truths and justifications, tired of men deciding what's best for me without asking me." She left the room, leaving behind 2 men and a truth that had changed everything once again. The days following the revelation of the recording dragged through Blackwood Manor like a silent funeral. Isabella completely avoided Edward, taking her meals in her room and going out only for solitary walks through the gardens when she was sure he was in the office. The atmosphere of the house had changed, charged with a tension that even Thomas felt, moving through the corridors with more cautious steps, as if fearing to awaken something that should remain dormant. Eric, on the other hand, had become a constant presence. He appeared every morning with documents to review, contracts to explain, and a calculated gentleness that Isabella was beginning to perceive, but still couldn't completely reject. He was her only connection to the truth about her past, the only person who seemed willing to give her direct answers without hiding hidden motives. "You need to make a decision soon," he said one April morning as they had coffee on the back veranda. The sun filtered through the leaves of the cherry trees, creating a play of light and shadow that should be comforting, but that only intensified the sense of unreality that had settled in Isabella's life. "About the will? About your whole life?" Eric leaned forward, his brown eyes fixed on hers. "You can't stay here forever living like a prisoner in a house full of ghosts. You need to decide if you want control over your destiny or if you prefer to let Edward continue making decisions for you." Isabella stirred the sugar in her coffee with mechanical movements. Since the night of the recording, she felt as if she were floating, disconnected from her own life. "And you think marrying you is the solution?" "I think getting married would be mutually beneficial," he replied with a frankness that could be refreshing if it wasn't also slightly disturbing. "You obtain financial independence and control over your inheritance. I obtain legal recognition as a Parker heir. We both free ourselves from Edward's manipulations. And love? Doesn't it enter the equation?" Eric smiled, a smile that managed to be charming and cold at the same time. "Love is a luxury, Isabella. Freedom is a necessity. Our mothers loved the wrong men and paid with their lives for it. We can choose to be smarter." There was a cruel logic in those words that she couldn't completely deny. Still, something inside her resisted the idea of reducing her life to a commercial transaction, even if it was an advantageous transaction. "I need more time." "Of course. But while you decide, perhaps you should know that Edward isn't being completely honest about your current financial situation." Isabella looked at him with renewed curiosity. "What do you mean?" "Blackwood's businesses haven't been doing well for several years. The companies are in debt. There are investigations by the Attorney General about tax irregularities, and the only thing keeping everything running is the money from the Parker inheritance, the money that is technically yours." "Is that true?" "I can show you the documents if you want. Edward has been using your inheritance as collateral for increasingly larger loans. If the companies fail, you lose everything along with them." Isabella felt a new wave of anger. First, Edward had hidden the second will. Then she had discovered his role in her mother's internment. Now it seemed he was also spending her money without authorization. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because we're family. Because our mother deserves that we protect what she left. For us. Eric extended his hand, covering hers on the table. And because, despite everything, I care about you. There was something in the way he said these words that made Isabella feel uncomfortable. But before she could better analyze what it was, Thomas appeared on the veranda. "Miss Isabella," said the butler, his voice carrying an unusual concern. "There's someone here to see you, a lady who says she has information about your mother." Isabella and Eric exchanged looks. What kind of information? She refused to say. She only said it was urgent and that it concerned what really happened. To Mrs. Elizabeth, Isabella stood up immediately. "Where is she?" "In the visiting room." "But miss, perhaps it would be better to call Mr. Edward." "No," she said firmly. "I don't want him to be present. Eric, are you coming with me?" He nodded, also standing up. "Of course." The woman who awaited them in the visiting room was approximately 60 years old, grey hair tied in an austere bun, and simple but impeccable clothes. There was something in her posture that suggested a dignity built on years of hard work and few privileges. "Miss Parker," she said, rising when Isabella entered. "First to Sadu Mercer. I'm Carmen Davis. I worked as a nurse at St. Helens Clinic for 15 years until 2005. Isabella felt her heart race. "Did you know my mother?" "I knew her, and I came here because I can no longer live with what I know without doing something about it." Carmen looked nervously at Eric. "Perhaps it would be better if we spoke alone." "He's my brother," said Isabella. "You can speak in front of him." Carmen reluctantly nodded. "Your mother wasn't sick when she was admitted. At least not in the way the doctors claimed. She was desperate, traumatized, but completely lucid." "Then why was she kept there?" "Because the man who paid for her stay, your legal father, had agreements with the doctors. Your mother received medications to keep her sedated most of the time. In the moments when she was conscious, she constantly talked about her children, about how she needed to protect them." "Children, in the plural." Carmen looked at Eric, then back at Isabella. She knew she had a boy somewhere, but didn't know where. She said the child's father had promised to take care of him, but she had never seen him again. Eric paled. "She knew about me." "She knew you existed, but didn't know your name or where you were." Alexander never allowed her to know. Carmen took a crumpled envelope from her purse. "She gave me this 2 weeks before leaving the clinic. She asked me to deliver it if her children ever came looking for her." Isabella took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written in the delicate handwriting she recognized from the diaries, but beside it was another name, Eric, my lost son. "What happened to her after she left the clinic?" Carmen hesitated. "Officially, she was discharged due to improvement in her condition. Unofficially," she lowered her voice, "she escaped one night during the shift change, but there were men waiting for her outside." "What men?" "Men who worked for your father. I saw from the window when they put her in a car and took her away. I never heard from her again." Isabella opened the envelope, revealing a letter and a small golden key. The letter was addressed to both. "My dear children, if you are reading this, it means you have managed to find each other despite all efforts to keep you separated. The key opens a safe deposit box at Central Bank, downtown branch, number 2847. There are documents there that prove the truth about everything that happened. Use this information to protect each other and to ensure that justice is done. Always remember, you are blood siblings, united by the love of a mother who never stopped thinking of you. Don't let the mistakes of adults destroy what is most pure between you. With all my love, Elizabeth." When Isabella finished reading, tears were running down her face. Eric, beside her, seemed equally moved. "We need to go to the bank," he said, his voice choked. Carmen stood up, preparing to leave. "There's one more thing you need to know. Your mother didn't die of cancer, as was officially registered." "How did she die?" "I don't know. I only know that 3 days after I saw her being taken from the clinic, it appeared in the newspapers that she had died from complications of a prolonged illness. But I knew her for years, and I can guarantee Elizabeth was physically healthy when she left there. After Carmen left, Isabella and Eric remained silent in the visiting room, processing the new revelations. The truth about their mother was even darker than they had imagined. "Let's go to the bank now," said Isabella finally. "Now?" "Now. I'm tired of discovering the truth in pieces. I want to know everything at once." As they prepared to leave, neither noticed Edward standing in the shadow of the corridor, having heard every word of the conversation. His face was as pale as paper, and his hands trembled when he picked up the phone to make a call he knew would change everything. Safe. Deposit box number 2847 at Central Bank held secrets that would make any thriller seem mild. Isabella and Eric remained silent during the trip to downtown, each lost in thoughts about what they might find. The golden key Elizabeth had left weighed in Isabella's hand like a promise and a threat at the same time. The bank manager, a middle-aged man with bifocal glasses and extremely formal manners, led them to the safe deposit room after meticulously verifying their identity documents. "This box was rented in 1987, he explained, as they walked through corridors illuminated by fluorescent lights. The maintenance fee was paid in advance for 20 years, then automatically renewed through a checking account." "What checking account?" asked Eric. "An account in the name of Elizabeth Smith. Curiously, the deposits continued to be made even after the account holder was registered as deceased in 2003. Isabella and Eric exchanged significant looks. Someone had kept the box active even after Elizabeth's official death, which suggested they knew of its importance. When the safe deposit box opened, it revealed a collection of items that told a more complex and frightening story than either of them could have imagined. There were original medical documents proving that Elizabeth's psychiatric evaluations were false, recordings on cassette tapes, compromising photographs, and contracts that exposed a network of corruption involving not only Alexander and Edward, but influential politicians, judges, and businessmen. "My God," murmured Isabella, leafing through a true medical report that showed her mother was mentally stable at the time of her internment. She documented everything. Eric picked up one of the cassette tapes, reading the handwritten label, "Conversation between AP and corrupt doctor, 03/12/1987. Your mother was smarter than anyone imagined. She knew that one day she would need to prove her innocence." But it was the last folder they found that changed everything. Simply marked as the truth, it contained documents that revealed not just Alexander's crimes, but also something neither of them expected. Edward had been blackmailed all these years. The pages told the story of how Alexander discovered that Edward had accidentally run over and killed a pedestrian in 1985, driving drunk after a business party. Alexander had helped cover up the accident, paid for the falsification of evidence, and for the silence of witnesses. In exchange, Edward had essentially become his slave, obligated to sign any document, agree with any decision, including Elizabeth's internment. "He was being blackmailed," said Isabella, her voice loaded with painful understanding. "All these years, Edward didn't have a choice." Eric frowned. "That doesn't excuse what he did." "It doesn't excuse it, but it explains it," Isabella continued reading. "Look at this. There's a letter from Elizabeth to Edward written shortly before she disappeared from the clinic. The letter, dated March 2003, was a forgiveness and a confession at the same time. "My dear Edward, I know you will never read this letter, but I need to write it before it's too late. I discovered this truth about the accident, about how Alexander has used it to control you all these years. I know you didn't want to commit me, that you were forced to sign those papers. I also know that you have tried to protect me in your way, even within the limitations Alexander imposed. I don't blame you for the choices you were forced to make. I blame myself for not having been strong enough to fight against the system that imprisoned us. If something happens to me, I want you to know that I forgive you, and I want you to find a way to forgive yourself too. Our children deserve to know the truth, but they deserve even more to have the chance to choose how to use that truth. Don't let guilt destroy the possibilities of redemption that still exist. With eternal love, Elizabeth." When Isabella finished reading, tears were flowing freely down her face. The story she had constructed in her mind about Edward as a villain was beginning to crumble, replaced by a more complex understanding of how people can be forced to make impossible choices. "There's more," said Eric, picking up a sealed envelope marked with "Urgent, open only in case of death." Inside they found Elizabeth's final confession. She had not died of natural causes. Alexander had slowly poisoned her during the last months of her life, using corrupt medical contacts to disguise the murder as death by disease. "He killed her," whispered Isabella. "Literally killed her." "And there's more," said Eric, his voice tense. "Look at the date of this last letter." The letter was from just 3 months ago, written in the same handwriting as Elizabeth's, but with a trembling letter that suggested illness or advanced age. "If you are reading this, it means you have finally met. Yes, I am still alive. Alexander believed he killed me, but I managed to escape with Carmen's help, who falsified my death and hid me all these years. I am sick now, really sick, and I know I don't have much time, but I needed you to know the complete truth before I depart. Edward is not the villain of this story. He's just another victim of Alexander's manipulations. If there is true love between you, Isabella, don't let the mistakes of the past destroy it. And Eric, my lost son, don't let the thirst for revenge corrupt your heart, as happened with your biological father. There is one last surprise waiting for you in the mirrored room of Blackwood Manor. Look behind the oval mirror on the east wall. There you will find the keys to true freedom. All my love, Elizabeth, your mother, who always loved you." The silence that followed was loaded with revelations that changed everything. Elizabeth had been alive until recently. Edward was a victim, not a perpetrator. And there were still more secrets waiting at the manor. "We need to go back," said Isabella, hurriedly putting away the documents. "Wait," said Eric, holding her arm. "Before we go back, I need to tell you something. Something I discovered yesterday that will change everything you think about me." "What?" Eric took a deep breath as if preparing to jump off a cliff. "I knew our mother was alive. I've known for 6 months. Isabella felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. "What?" "She sought me out, said she was dying and wanted to meet me before departing. We met a few times, always in secret." Eric lowered his eyes, unable to face her. "She told me everything about Edward, about the blackmail, about how he had no choice. And she asked me to protect him when the truth came out. Then why, sir? Why did I reveal the recording? Why did I make you hate him?" Eric finally looked her in the eyes. "Because I'm a coward, Isabella. Because I was jealous of the love I saw between you. Because I wanted to destroy that before you discovered that I'm not the man I pretended to be." Isabella backed away, shocked by the confession. "You lied to me about everything." "Not about everything. I really am your brother. I really want you to have your inheritance, but—" He hesitated. "The will I showed is fake. I forged it to have an excuse to get close to you." The betrayal cut deeper than Isabella expected. First Edward, now Eric. All the men in her life seemed incapable of telling the truth. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because when our mother told me about you, when she showed me your photographs, I fell in love. Not as a brother, Isabella, as a man." Eric moved closer, his eyes shining with a disturbing intensity. "I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible, but I couldn't help it. And when I saw you with Edward, when I realized you loved him despite everything—" "You're insane," said Isabella, backing up until she hit the wall of the safe deposit box. "We're siblings." "We're half-siblings," he corrected. "And there are precedents, there are ways—" "Stop!" Isabella pushed him when he tried to get closer. "It doesn't matter what we are. It doesn't matter how many documents you forge or how many lies you tell. I could never, ever see you that way." Eric's face changed, the mask of charm finally falling completely. "It's because of him, isn't it? Because of Edward. Even knowing everything he did, even seeing how he destroyed our family. You still love him." "Yes," she said, surprising. Herself with the certainty in her own voice. "I love him. Despite everything, I love him." Eric's expression transformed from despair to something much more dangerous. "Then you've chosen. And I know what I need to do. Before Isabella could ask what he meant, Eric ran out of the safe deposit room, leaving her alone with the devastating truth and a terrible premonition that she had set in motion something she couldn't stop. The taxi that brought Isabella back to Blackwood Manor cut through the grey afternoon like a blade through silk. She held against her chest the folder with the documents from the safe deposit box, feeling the weight of the truth like an anchor pulling her to unknown depths. Eric's confession echoed in her mind, mixing with the revelation that her mother had been alive until a few months ago, creating a whirlwind of emotions she could barely process. When she arrived at the manor, she found the doors open and a silence that seemed loaded with omens. Thomas was nowhere to be found, which was unusual for that time of day. The corridors seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if the house itself sensed that something definitive was about to happen. "Edward," she called, her voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no response. Isabella climbed the stairs toward the mirrored room her mother had mentioned in the letter. It was a room she had seen only once during her first week at the manor, and that had always caused her an inexplicable discomfort. The walls were covered with antique mirrors of various sizes and shapes, some adorned with golden frames, others simply attached to the walls like windows to parallel dimensions. She easily found the oval mirror on the east wall. It was the largest of all, with an ornate frame that seemed to tell a story in golden reliefs. When she pressed the edges, the mirror moved, revealing a secret compartment behind it. What she found inside made her sit on the floor, her legs trembling too much to support her. There were photographs of her mother with Edward, but not the young and happy photographs she already knew. These were recent, from just a few months ago. Elizabeth was visibly older, more fragile, but her eyes maintained the same green intensity that Isabella saw in the mirror every day. And Edward was there with her, holding her hand, caring for her with a tenderness that spoke of love, that had survived 2 decades of separation. Along with the photographs, there was a modern digital recorder and a note in Edward's handwriting. "Isabella, if you found this, it means Elizabeth has departed and that you discovered the truth about our past. The recorder contains our last conversations. She wanted you to know how it really happened, wanted you to understand that true love can survive even the greatest betrayals. She died knowing that you and I would love each other, and made me promise I would fight for this love when the time came. The time has come. Edward." With trembling hands, Isabella pressed the play button. Her mother's voice, weak but unmistakably the same one she heard in dreams, began to speak. "My dear daughter, if you're listening to this, it means you've finally met Edward, and that you've discovered the feelings that exist between you. Don't be frightened, my love. There's nothing wrong with loving the man who was the great love of my life." The recording continued, revealing how Elizabeth had managed to contact Edward in the last months of her life, how they met secretly several times, how she told him about Eric and about the documents hidden in the safe deposit box. "Edward never stopped loving me, Isabella, nor did I stop loving him. But our time passed. Our chance is gone. You have a new chance, a chance you built, on the ruins of our lost love. Don't let guilt or fear destroy what is most pure between you." Edward's voice then joined the recording. "Elizabeth made me see that carrying guilt for the rest of my life doesn't honor the dead nor help the living. She forgave me, Isabella. She forgave me completely. Now I need to learn to forgive myself, too, and I need you to forgive me." "She has already forgiven you," came Elizabeth's response, and Isabella could hear the smile in her voice. "I see it in her eyes when she speaks your name. I see the same love I felt for you, but more mature, stronger. Fight for it, Edward. Fight for her as you couldn't fight for me." Isabella's tears fell on the photographs as the recording continued, revealing her mother's last days, the love that still existed between her and Edward, but also the acceptance that they belonged to the past and that the future was for Isabella and Edward to build together. When the recording ended, Isabella remained seated on the floor of the mirrored room, seeing her own image reflected in dozens of different surfaces. Each mirror showed a different aspect of who she was: the orphaned daughter, the wealthy heiress, the woman in love, the young woman who needed to choose her own destiny. It was then that she heard footsteps in the corridor. "Isabella?" came Edward's voice, loaded with concern. "I'm here," she answered, her voice hoarse from so much crying. When he appeared at the door of the mirrored room and saw the photographs scattered on the floor, the documents, the recorder, his expression changed from concern to something that mixed relief and terror. "You know," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I know everything. About the blackmail, about my mother being alive, about you meeting." Isabella rose slowly, wiping the tears from her face. "I also know about Eric, about his lies, about the fake will." Edward took a step toward her, hesitant. "Isabella, I know you had no choice about my mother's internment. I know Alexander forced you to do terrible things. I know you loved her until the end, but that she wanted you to move on." Isabella approached him, her green eyes meeting his. "And I know that I love you. Despite everything, because of everything, I love you." The relief on Edward's face was like seeing the sun rise after an eternal night. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was crumbling. "Elizabeth made me promise I would fight for you," he murmured against her hair, "that I wouldn't let the past destroy our future." "Then fight," she whispered, tilting her face to look at him. "Fight for us." When their lips met, it was as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle finally fit together. This wasn't the hesitant kiss of the first time, loaded with guilt and doubts. This was a kiss of recognition, of choice, of two adults who had passed through the shadows and chosen the light. But their happiness lasted only a few seconds. The sound of a gun being cocked made them abruptly separate. At the door of the mirrored room, Eric watched them with an expression that had definitely crossed the line between passion and madness. "What a touching scene," he said, pointing the pistol alternately at Isabella and Edward. "True love triumphing over all obstacles. Too bad some obstacles can't simply be ignored." "Eric," said Isabella calmly, although her heart was racing, "put down the gun. This isn't how things are solved." "No?" he laughed, but the sound was devoid of any joy. "Then how are they solved, Isabella? You live happily ever after while I stay alone, knowing I lost the only person who could make me feel complete?" "I couldn't make you feel complete," she said, taking a small step forward. "No one can do that for another person. You need to find that completeness within yourself." "Cheap philosophy," spat Eric. "Easily said by someone who has everything. But I have nothing, Isabella. My mother died without really knowing me. My father kept me as a dirty secret, and the only woman I've ever loved chose another man." Edward stepped forward, placing himself between Isabella and the gun. "If you want to shoot someone, shoot me. She's not to blame for your feelings." "What a noble gesture," mocked Eric. "But it's not you I want dead, Edward. It's her. Because if I can't have her, no one can." The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to make breathing difficult. The mirrors reflected the scene from multiple angles, creating a kaleidoscopic vision of love, madness, and despair that seemed straight out of a nightmare. It was then that Thomas silently appeared behind Eric, holding a heavy crystal vase. The blow was accurate and silent. Eric collapsed to the floor unconscious, the gun escaping from his hand and sliding across the marble. "Forgive the delay," said the elderly butler, catching his breath. "But I thought it better to call the police before intervening." Minutes later, sirens cut through the silence of the afternoon, and Isabella finally understood that some stories can only have a happy ending after all the ghosts of the past are definitely exorcised. 6 months later, Blackwood Manor had completely transformed. Windows that previously remained closed now opened to let in the sunlight. Mirrors covered by sheets were uncovered, and the out-of-tune piano in the East Tower finally received the maintenance it deserved. Isabella played every morning, her compositions echoing through the corridors like a soundtrack of rebirth. Eric had been committed to a private psychiatric clinic after his arrest. Examinations revealed a condition of obsessive disorder and psychotic episodes that, according to doctors, had been aggravated by the late discovery of his true identity and the loss of his mother. Isabella visited him once a month, not out of family obligation, but because Elizabeth, in her recordings, had asked them to take care of each other. The fraternal love she felt for him was real, even if distorted by circumstances. During one of these visits, on a sunny October afternoon, Eric finally managed to look her in the eyes without the disturbing intensity that had characterized their last encounters. "I'm sorry," he said, his hands trembling slightly, a side effect of the medication. "For everything, for the lie about the will, for the emotional blackmail, for having tried to force something that should never have existed." "I know," replied Isabella, covering his hand with hers, "and I forgive you. Our mother would forgive you too." "Edward, he's a good man. He always was." Eric smiled sadly. "It took me time to accept it, but it's true. He loves you in the right way, in a way I never could." "You're going to be all right," she said. "You'll learn to love yourself first, and then you'll find someone who can love you back in the right way." When she left the clinic that day, Isabella found Edward waiting for her in the car, as he always did. In the last few months, they had built a routine of mutual care that had nothing to do with the old power dynamics of the manor. He respected her need to maintain family ties with Eric, and she supported his efforts to rebuild the companies ethically, using the documents left by Elizabeth to expose and correct years of corruption. "How is he?" asked Edward when she got in the car. "Better, more lucid." Isabella settled in the passenger seat, observing the profile of the man she had chosen to love, despite all the complications. "I think he's finally accepted that our mother is gone, and that forcing a relationship with me would never bring her back." "And the doctors? What do they say about his release?" "Maybe next year if he continues responding well to treatment." She touched his hand on the gear shift. "Edward, there's something I need to tell you." He glanced at her, a familiar concern. Crossing his face, "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The car almost skidded. Edward gently stepped on the brake, pulling over to the side of the road that led back to the manor. When he turned to look at her completely, his eyes shone with an emotion she took a few seconds to identify as pure joy. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I took 3 different tests." Isabella smiled, that luminous smile he had learned to recognize as a sign of genuine happiness. "I know we didn't plan it. I know it's complicated considering our history, but it's perfect," he interrupted, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of promises and possible futures. "It's absolutely perfect." They married in a small, intimate ceremony in the chapel of the manor itself, with Thomas as witness, and Carmen, Elizabeth's former nurse, as Isabella's maid of honor. There was no unnecessary luxury or ostentation, just 2 people who had chosen to build something new on the ashes of the past. The daughter born in May had her grandmother's green eyes and her mother's determined smile. They named her Hope, not in honor of the clinic where Elizabeth suffered, but for the meaning of the name, the expectation of something desired. It was a conscious choice to transform pain into light, tragedy into hope. On a winter afternoon, while Edward worked in his office and Hope slept in the crib beside the piano, Isabella found one last letter from her mother. Hidden between the pages of a book of sheet music, she was reorganizing in the library. "My dear daughter," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means you chose love, despite all the reasons to reject it. It means you found strength to forgive the mistakes of the past and courage to build a different future. I am proud of the woman you have become, proud of the choices you made. Edward is a good man who carried guilt that wasn't entirely his. Love each other with the intensity that he and I never could have, but without the fears that separated us. Raise children who will know only the luminous version of love, not the shadows we inhabited. And always remember, true love isn't the one that avoids obstacles, but the one that transforms them into bridges to a better place. Live, my daughter. Live completely, with all the love I couldn't give in life, Elizabeth." Isabella carefully folded the letter, keeping it with the other mementos of her mother. Outside the rain was beginning to fall again, but this time she didn't hear melancholy in the sound of the drops against the glass. She heard renewal, heard the promise that all storms eventually pass, leaving the air cleaner and the earth more fertile. Edward appeared in the library, attracted by the sound of the piano that had abruptly stopped. He found Isabella standing before the window, hope in her arms, both watching the rain with serene expressions. "Everything all right?" he asked, approaching and wrapping his arms around them. "Everything. Perfect," answered Isabella, leaning against his chest. "Absolutely perfect." And for the first time in decades, Blackwood Manor was truly a home, a place where the past had been honored but not idolized, where mistakes had been forgiven but not forgotten, and where love had found a way to flourish even in the most unlikely soil. Elizabeth could finally rest in peace, knowing that her interrupted love story had transformed into a new, fulfilled love story, and that her daughter had chosen not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to create a future where true love could exist without fear, without guilt, without the shadows that had for so long haunted the corridors of that house. Love had won, not because it was easy, but because it was consciously chosen, bravely defended, and patiently nurtured. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson a mother could leave for a daughter, that some happy endings are worth all the battles necessary to conquer them.